reverse the standard. No matter how dark the skin, woolly the hair, or thick the lips, you don't have to be a Negro.
When black contribution to civilization is too obvious, let's find a way to attribute it to outside white influences.
When all the ancient historians contradict your theory, we'll just discredit them.
The Catholic Church on the Apache reservation. You don't hear about this. You know, we hear about protests everywhere. The Apache's sacred mountain, their most sacred mountain, the Vatican somehow got permission from the U.S. government to build a observatory on top of this mountain. And of all the names that they choose, the acronym for this observatory is Lucifer. So, you know, the Apache people are still protesting it. It's their most sacred mountain. Why? They say, according to their oral tradition, that this is where they would communicate with the gods. This is where they would communicate with the star beings and the people from the heavens. And this is exactly where the Catholic Church comes and builds this observatory. Why do you think that is?
To me, it's obvious that they're in one accord with all those things. To me, I mean, when I see what they're got going on, of course, the people that haven't looked into the Catholic origins and looked into the rituals and looked into the reasons behind them, it would seem like a mystery. But to us, obviously, it makes a lot of sense, you know, why they would do this stuff, because they are trying to channel these things. And that's why the militaries build bases on these things. They're trying to channel these things and channel whatever's coming through there. I know in different religions and cultures, they want to call it whatever, whether they want to call it the Mahat, a universal mind, whether they want to call it chi or whatever they want to call it. Some places don't really describe an entity a lot attached with it, more of an energy. But yeah, it's pretty amazing. And you know, I guess when I see all these ancient societies, and I see a lot of, because I mean, when you look at the mounds, they obviously had some kind of you know, we talked about the agenda. They did it. You said they built it underneath the constellation Draco. It's built on ley lines. It's built with the solstice markers. This stuff ties in with every ancient civilization in the world, and to have it so scattered all over the world that these things happen. And I remember you talked before, because a lot of people believe that the Native Americans were mound builders, but I believe you have told me before that that's not the case. That's usually not what they do.
Right. A lot of the tribes, when you ask the elders who built the mounds, typically the answer that you're going to hear is, we didn't build them. They were here when we already got here, or the giants built them. Now, that's not to say that Native people did not build mounds to try to copy what they were seeing around them, and we do have evidence of that. And that we see mounds that are smaller, not these great stature or size of mounds that you typically see like in the ancient earthworks. So although there is mound building that was done by Native tribes, for the most part, not to the stature of you know, what this Nephilim architecture, these gigantic earthworks that were built long before, you know, it's 300, 400 BC, any of the other tribes that ever even been in this area. So that's typically what you're going to hear from Native people concerning the mounds. But regardless of that, the Native people are also going to be fierce protectors of these sites, of these sacred sites, because that's part of the code of Indian living, is being protectors of these sacred grounds, regardless of who built them.
Names. This will disguise their true black identity.
It's changed the criteria for defining race. For example, one drop of Negro blood in America makes you a Negro, no matter how light the
Now,
skin.
when we're looking at these mounds, of course, when we were out on the site, whoever's putting up kind of the tourist signs and stuff, they're attributing a lot of these mounds to the Native people. Who's kind of disseminating that information? And because, I mean, why are they saying there that the natives have made it if most of the tribal people that are being asked are denying any involvement in the mounds themselves?
I've never quite understood that, Jake. Even when I was taking anthropology and archaeology courses and doing my graduate studies, and I was just floored at how few or how little the oral tradition of the native people was even considered as a valid source for explaining archaeological finds or artifacts or anything that was discovered by academia. I was actually told by my professor that the native oral tradition doesn't hold any weight because it wasn't in writing, because we didn't write anything down. Well, the Mayans and Incans, they did. The Mayans especially wrote a lot of their history down, despite the Catholics coming in and burning scrolls and untold, who knows, years, centuries worth of history of ancient America. There's still writing that's been left behind. The oral tradition isn't just a telephone game story where one native tells it to another native, and then by the time the fifth native hears it, the story's changed. The traditional storytellers are chosen from birth. It still happens this way. They're chosen from birth, and then picked. Which one has a propensity for memorization, and then those are trained to be the storytellers. They're trained this way because they cannot add a word to a story, and they can't take one away, and they have to tell the story the same way it was told 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. So the integrity of the story doesn't change.
When we look at how the American government, the U.S. government, has kind of, in a way, created their own version of Native history, and with some of your work kind of showing the idea that a lot of the Native tribes migrated from the Middle East, have lineage back to the tribes of Israel. What do you see as kind of the purpose behind this false history that I remember hearing growing up in school in the history textbooks? Oh, Christopher Columbus got over here and he found the natives here and they'd been here all along, and there's no way that they, So what is kind of the agenda behind this false narrative, this false history that's being told about the natives here in the Americas? And what do you have to say about what's kind of being perpetrated in schools, in history books, that flat out deny the idea that native tribes migrated over from the Middle East? What is the purpose of this false narrative?
I often rack my brain trying to figure that out. And now I don't think that all tribes have a Hebraic origin. I don't believe that all tribes have that Semitic genetics. But I do. The research does really point to some tribes that not just through linguistics, but through cultural traditions, through spiritual traditions, and even now through DNA. National Geographic just did an article a few years ago talking about the origin of some tribes in the native DNA, and the markers that were showing up were Middle Eastern markers. And this is mostly tribes that were on the East Coast, and it's also in the southwestern part of the country. Cover up why the blatant, I can't even begin to understand. There is absolute concrete archaeological evidence that the Mayans and the Incans were all the way up through Florida, even as far as Okmulgee, Georgia, and going into Ohio. There's a definite Mayan Incan influence in architecture, in religion, in the art, in the iconography. You definitely see the Central American motifs, religion, spiritual way, cultures, and traditions. Why do archaeologists deny it? I don't know. Do they want to deny? I guess they don't want to say, oh, well, you know what? These people aren't actually immigrants from south of the border. They've been here longer than anybody else have. I don't know. That's just me being cynical, but it proves that there was a presence here of indigenous people from south of the border. It also disproves a lot of the theories of academia. There is a complete blatant denial.
They are the oldest skulls in the Americas. this is the oldest of them all. The skull of a young woman nicknamed Luthia by scientists. Can she tell us who the first Americans were? Walter Neves is a physical anthropologist at Sao Paulo University in Brazil. He's been using a standard and reliable archaeological measure, the shape of the skull, to find out what race she belonged to.
91.
He fully expected Luthia to be a Mongoloid, an ancestor of the American Indians.
91.
But then he fed the measurements into the computer.
When we started running the computer and seeing the results, it was amazing because we realized that the statistics, the quantitative analysis we were doing was not showing just people to be Mongoloid. In fact, the analysis was showing just people as anything except Mongoloid.
So who was Luthia? And where did she come from? To find out, the skull was taken to a hospital in Rio de Janeiro to begin the process of reconstructing her face. The first stage was to make a three-dimensional CAT scan of Luthia's skull in order to build a replica. The cast was then given to Richard Neve of the University of Manchester in England, one of the world's leading forensic artists, to recreate her features.
That, to me, is a Negroid face that has all the features you associate with a Negroid face. The proportions of the face, it doesn't say anything about it being a Mongoloid.
When black contribution to civilization is too obvious, let's find a way to attribute it to outside white influences.
When all the ancient historians contradict your theory, we'll just discredit them.